We are live and recording. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today, especially to our speakers and all the participants. My name is Shannon Blankenship, Advocacy Director at St. Johns Riverkeeper. I'm joined by my co-host, Jimmy Orth, Executive Director. And today we're discussing how cities are stepping up to the challenge of solving climate change issues. We'll be joined today by guests Chris Castro and Brittany Sellers, both with the City of Orlando, to discuss how Orlando is an example worth replicating throughout the watershed. We'll cover how cities are playing a vital role in enforcing climate change reductions. We'll then have our guest speakers join us for a focus on how Orlando specifically is taking on this challenge. And then last, we'll end with viewer comments and questions. So stick around, and for those of you viewing this on Facebook, go to stjohnsriverkeeper.org, take action, and tune in via Zoom to participate live and be able to ask our guest speakers today questions that you may have when we finish with this episode. To begin though, Jimmy, would you tell us about St. Johns Riverkeeper and why we're hosting this series to help us fulfill our mission?
Sure, absolutely. St. Johns Riverkeeper, for as many of you probably know, but if you're new to our organization and this webinar series, we are a nonprofit advocacy group for the St. Johns River. We're really a watchdog group. Our job is to defend the St. Johns, to ensure that the regulatory agencies are implementing laws that are going to protect the river and that those laws are being enforced. And we also have a role in raising awareness in the community and educating youth. And so we do that in a lot of different ways. And I would encourage you to visit our website, stjohnsriverkeeper.org, and you can learn a lot about upcoming events that we have. Unfortunately, they're mostly, well, I guess right now they're all virtual, and none of them are in person. Well, hopefully we'll get back to some of the cleanups and things that we were doing before. But a lot of information about the issues as well and how you can get involved. We started this really as part of the dredging project for the St. Johns River. Through that process, we started to really understand how deepening a waterway can actually increase storm surge and water levels farther inland. And so it can actually exacerbate the impacts of sea level rise and climate change. So we started a River Rising town hall series to raise awareness about not only sea level rise, but the impacts obviously of the dredging and how that's going to make things worse. And through that process, we really realized there was so much public support for efforts to create a more resilient community. And we started advocating, becoming more involved in that. And one thing that I think is people wonder sometimes is, why is Riverkeeper concerned about flooding issues and storm surge? Well, every time we have a flooding event, it's an unmitigated pollution source to the river. There's a lot of different chemicals, pollutants that actually get washed into the St. Johns. And in a lot of cases, what we saw, like for instance, in Hurricane Irma, you also have sewage overflows. And so a lot of raw sewage ends up flowing in the river. And then of course, septic tanks don't work effectively, and those too fail. So it's a huge pollution problem for the St. Johns. And then of course, from climate change, we see issues like increased water temperatures, which also exacerbate the frequency of algae blooms in the river. So climate change and sea level rise are having a huge impact on the St. Johns. So we felt like it was important now to have this series to really raise awareness and let people know what some of the solutions are and what some of the other communities are doing, such as Orlando.
So connected to that, in 2017, President Trump announced plans to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Agreement, for the first time, brought together nations under a common cause to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius this century. In the 2 years since this announcement, states, cities, businesses, and universities have joined coalitions that support the Paris Agreement, and these coalitions actually represent 65% of the US population and 68% of our economy. One of these is called the climate mayors, and climate mayors from around the world stepped up, including the City of Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer. And so today we're going to hear more about what the City of Orlando is doing to mitigate and adapt to climate change. But first, Jimmy, how can we here at St. Johns Riverkeeper do our part throughout the watershed to see other cities step up in the way that Orlando's done?
Well, I think first is the acknowledgement of how important cities are to solving this problem. This is really, honestly, not going to be solved, the problem at the state or even the federal level. It's up to cities. And the reason I say that is because cities, according to the United Nations Environment Program, quote, cities are responsible for 75% of global CO2 emissions. So one way that we can get there is through collaboration, regional collaboration. And that's happened in places throughout Florida. I know in East Central Florida, for instance, Orlando is participating in a regional collaboration. Chris or Brittany, either one will talk about this at one point, touch on this, but regional planning councils throughout the state are bringing counties and cities together to solve this problem together. And I think that's really where the best opportunity is, frankly, is to look at this from a regional perspective on the local level and try to come up with solutions that make sense for each different region of the country and of our state and our watershed, frankly.
You know, in the state of Florida, most climate change focus, rightfully so, it's on the coasts. And when people think about climate change, I think the image that comes to mind is sea level rise and flooding. So it's maybe a little ironic today that we're focusing on the great work that the City of Orlando is doing, a city that is entirely inland. And really, I think changing the way a lot of us think about climate change action. So today, Chris Castro, Director of Sustainability and Resilience for the City of Orlando, as well as being the co-chair of the Smart Cities Initiative, will be joining us. And we're also joined by Brittany Sellers, Sustainability and Project Manager, focusing on energy, water, and transportation with the City of Orlando. And Brittany, we're going to start with you. I want to jump right in and sort of, leverage that question about Orlando is an inland city. Can you tell us about the hazards that Orlando is experiencing related to climate change?
Absolutely. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you again for providing the opportunity for us to share some of the information about what the City of Orlando is doing in regards to climate change, our climate strategy, and facing some of these changes that we're seeing. As an inland city, I think it is maybe not top of mind what individuals think of when they imagine sea level rise in Florida, as you stated. But what's interesting about the city is that because we are located so centrally, we typically get at least some effects of hurricanes, regardless of which coast that they're trending towards. So we're pretty much preparing at all times. But even more than that, because there isn't a threat of storm surge in the city of Orlando, and because we are inland, our effects tend to be less. And so a lot of individuals look to Orlando and our huge hospitality industry as opportunities for evacuation shelter. Our hotels typically book up with Orlando residents. There are a lot of provisions in place where those spaces know, and the management team knows that that's how they act for some portion of the year. A lot of them are pet friendly, which is helpful, but that's certainly a luxury that's not available to everyone. And so we have a large focus, of course, on considering the duality of places like our community centers and other spaces that can serve to meet some of the needs that we see during our storm season every year, particularly in regards to increase in the magnitude of those storms and just more that we're going to see over time. And that's only short term. In the long term, we're seeing climate migration as one of the single largest threats to the area in terms of being able to provide affordable housing, education, basic human services when we get such an influx of individuals, often all at the same time. And we saw that after Hurricane Maria, where we had an influx of Puerto Ricans come to the area, and many of whom decided to stay over time, but it was difficult to anticipate. We didn't know how long. Thankfully, our Hispanic Affairs office set up an entire welcome center at the airport and did what they could to remain flexible and accommodating as much as possible. But I think that's one of those conversations where shocks versus stressors takes on a different meaning when we're thinking about regular peaks in our local population versus longer term trends that we're seeing as individuals are coming here either out of necessity avoiding those storms, or for some individuals who have the opportunity even selling some of their properties on the coast and moving inland and kind of getting ahead of the curve from a real estate perspective.
So I heard you talk about climate refugees. I heard you talk about having hurricane impacts no matter what coast it's on, right? And I think for us here in the St. Johns River watershed, we can understand that, because the second that we hear that a hurricane isn't going to hit our coast, we're able to sort of say, oh, okay, well, we made it through this one. But when you're in the middle of the state, it doesn't matter, right, where that hurricane's coming, you're going to have impacts. But I also just want to jump on with some of the impacts we know for those of us thinking about the St. Johns River and its springs. One of the impacts that we're seeing of climate change is that we're seeing more extremes, right? So extremes when it comes to temperatures, but also extremes when it comes to our water levels, because it's so connected with seasons of very high precipitation followed by seasons of drought. And naturally, we always have that back and forth, right? That balance of seasonal highs and lows. But as that becomes more extreme, our springs are really starting to feel that. And again, when you're sort of constantly being forced into those extremes, it's hard to be able to bounce back to some of these stressors that we're seeing. So that's something to sort of, just jump on to how our springs are being impacted by climate change. And then another big thing that I think, is maybe outside of what we all think about when it comes to these storms is that many of our toxins that we've used, before we had Clean Water Act regulations have settled to the bottom of our waterways. And as more and more storms come, and we're seeing that more often, we're seeing those sediments get reintroduced into the channel. And so we're seeing pollutant loads, from basically practices that happened decades ago. And you don't have to be a coastal city, to be seeing those impacts. These are inland, they're in our rivers, our creeks, our lakes. So throughout the entire watershed. And so just sort of jumping on with some of the ways that you don't have to have sea level rise impacts of climate change to be seeing impacts to our inland counties and our waterways.
Yes, definitely. And I think, unfortunately, it really is the perfect storm in Florida, where we experience such heavy frequency and magnitude of various different types of events or climate vulnerabilities just across the state. We're the lightning capital, we are the sinkhole capital, we are the extreme heat capital, and all of these things really come together. And when we have these periods of heavy precipitation, where there is an increased probability of inland flooding, and then followed by a series of drought, and then this extreme heat, that's our single largest climate change concern and climate vulnerability in the state of Florida and in the city of Orlando, where, again, because we're inland, the temperatures can rise, there's more resting ozone, there's concerns of that nature, less circulation going on at the state in our particular location. So we have extreme heat, then periods of drought. Then when there's more precipitation again, it doesn't settle in, it doesn't absorb the same way. So then there's more flooding. It makes sinkholes more likely. During the drought period, we're seeing more wildfires in the state of Florida than we saw previously. And essentially it's all working together just to overwhelm our system and make it likely that, yes, we are going to see issues in water quality. And that can come from a variety of sources, but algae blooms are something else that comes to mind. Increase in airborne and waterborne and vector-borne illnesses just across the board. When those stagnant ponds, for example, sit without long periods of precipitation, and there are mosquitoes that are breeding, and so on and so forth. So it's really a force multiplier, just having such a strong number of these individual events and hazards all occurring at once that make it difficult for us. And certainly something that we're mindful regardless of our geography in the state.
What are some things, Brittany, that y'all are doing just to stay on the kind of the flooding and heavy rain precipitation events topic? What are y'all doing to help mitigate some of those problems?
Right. So I actually have a bit of a slide deck presentation that might be helpful as we're getting in here. So if it's all right for me to screen share at this time.
Please do. Let me know if you have issues with that. You should have access.
Okay, will do. All right. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay, we're having such great conversation, but I'd be remiss to not share some of the details and information that we've taken the time to compile for you today. So just as a quick little bit of background on the city of Orlando, this touches on some of the strategies that I was just discussing earlier. As a sustainability project manager, our Office of Sustainability and Resilience has actually been around since 2007. We started as an initiative for Mayor Buddy Dyer as a focus to make Orlando one of the most environmentally sustainable, but also socially inclusive, economically vibrant, and climate resilient cities in the Southeast, if not the nation. And throughout the last 13 years, we have been established. We focus on a number of strategies across 7 different pillars of focus areas for our work. So we have transportation, local food, clean water, of course, livability, clean energy, green buildings, and solid waste. I knew I was forgetting something in there. Across the board for today's conversation, really looking at mitigating some of our climate risks and looking to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, clean energy, green buildings, and transportation are really top of mind. And I think it's also worth noting, we at any given time have a number of large projects on our plate, and we've implemented over 100 strategies over the last 13 years. So we are always moving and looking ahead. And as you mentioned earlier, with the shift that we're seeing at the federal level, Mayor Buddy Dyer doubled down and signed the Under 2 MOU, committing to some of the same actions that would put us in alignment with the Paris Accord. And actually, according to our community action plan that had been developed in 2013 with the local task force, we are already, our goals are actually already a little bit more ambitious than what's included in that MOU, which I think is worth mentioning. He was also one of the signatories of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, an international commitment that requires not only greenhouse gas emissions reporting, but climate vulnerability assessments and adaptation and resilience planning as well. And just a number of other organizations and commitments, collaboratives, consortiums that we're a part of, where we've not only stepped up to make some really ambitious commitments, but also work in alignment with our peers and constantly share best practices. And I am in this photo, that's just my forehead behind Chris's shoulder. In regards to the Global Covenant of Mayors and the Climate Mayor movement that really started in reaction to our withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, also known as the We Are Still In movement, we're one of, I believe this number might be up to over 500 climate mayors now, representing over 70 million Americans in cities where we've committed to go ahead and push forward with strategies in alignment with the Paris Agreement, regardless of leadership or lack thereof at a federal level. And it's very inspiring to be on these regular phone calls where mayors are sharing best practices. Some of them are from big, heavy hitting cities that you may be familiar with in terms of addressing climate change. Others may have populations of just a few thousand individuals, but they're all sharing the best information that they can across party lines. It doesn't matter, just taking the opportunity to step forward and take action. We also discussed earlier when we were kicking off this call, just some of the sources of GHG emissions and what we're seeing really from a city's perspective where the majority of our population lives and works now. That's really where we're seeing the majority of these emissions being generated across the city of Orlando. What I want to point out is what you see in green and blue here comes from our energy sector. So the vast majority of our emissions come from powering primarily our buildings, both our homes and our commercial buildings across the city. I sometimes joke, but despite all the traffic that we might see on I-4, the transportation is actually a relatively small wedge from that. So we really need to focus in on our buildings. There's small and somewhat negligent effects from some of our other areas regarding solid waste, water and wastewater, and so on and so forth. But from a GHG reduction standpoint, we really want to focus on energy and buildings, which is exactly what we've done, not only across our municipal operations, but also with some of our community-facing strategies. One thing I wanted to mention, if you look at this trend, we're kind of trending downwards, maybe not as much as we would like to see at this point, although we'll have a couple of years worth of data here and hopefully a decrease in trend that we're seeing there. But despite this entire period of relatively stable and somewhat decreasing GHG emissions, our population has bloomed, and we have a growth of about 2.5% in the city of Orlando every year, and our per capita emissions have been going down, which is exactly the trend that we want to see, as well as some of the impacts of the strategies, policies, and programs that we've passed over the last several years that essentially take a few years for their consequences to be demonstrated. So we can hope to see some of those impacts paying dividends more over time.
And Brittany, let me step in just real quick. I think the thing also that we have to remind ourselves is that this is when we tackle climate change and we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're also implementing renewable sources of energy and cleaner sources of energy, which I think is critical, because I think a lot of times we forget that when we produce less emissions, we also produce less pollution that impacts our waterways. For instance, nitrogen oxides and mercury is a huge problem in the St. Johns. Actually, air deposition, wet deposition, where it actually goes, emissions from nitrogen oxide go up into the air from smokestacks, and then it comes back down into our waterways. It's a big problem, a big contributing factor to the nitrogen pollution that we have in the St. Johns, as well as the mercury pollution that we have. And a lot of people don't realize that most fish species, unfortunately, are contaminated with mercury. And so it's a health hazard as well. So I think that's something I always like to remind people that tackling climate change, we're also tackling water quality problems as well.
Absolutely. It's definitely multifaceted. And I think even looking at some of these graphs, we're really honed in on a particular target, such as our 90% GHG reduction goal by the year 2040, really only tells part of the story regardless. And some of those peripheral and ancillary benefits can be just as significant, but it's just a variety of stories that we're sharing and essentially getting the ball rolling in some of these areas that just make it easier. And we see some of those increases paying dividends many times over. Yep, definitely. Again, just focusing in on some of our per capita reduction over time, and of course, a comparison between GDP and GHGs, demonstrating that, of course, these two concepts can be decoupled, and we are really working, particularly in the Greenworks office, with not only the rest of the city divisions, but also some of our other local partner municipalities and the community at large to work towards a clean energy future and a green economy, where there is an increase in green jobs, green opportunities, and functioning as a society where we can continue, especially in the city of Orlando, to deliver the quality of life and guest experience as the most visited city in the United States that we've come to be known for, but to do so in a sustainable, healthy, and proactive way. In regards to some of the goals that I've mentioned so far, we have our Municipal Sustainability Action Plan. That was the first thing, essentially, that our internal Greenworks Task Force put together after we were established as initially as this initiative. The Greenworks that we're known for were also known as the city's Office of Sustainability and Resilience. We became a formal office just a few years ago, so we use those terms interchangeably. But this really focused on our own city operations. So our police vehicles, our fire trucks, our community centers, City Hall, the parks and recreation services that we provide, the sidewalks that we're designing, everything that we have direct control over from a municipal operations side, what we can do in our own facilities and with our own assets was really the first step, just to make sure we're walking the talk. And that was updated in 2017. We also put together the following year Community Sustainability Action Plan, which provides not only that 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, but strategies designed to meet that goal across all of the focus areas that I had shared, which was also updated year before last. In 2017, we also put together our first climate vulnerability assessment. I was the primary author on this document. I'm happy to talk about it a little bit more, highlight some of the key vulnerabilities, which we've already started to discuss. And we'll be looking to amend this and expand it going forward as well with additional stakeholder input. But this has a lot of great information based on the empirical data that currently exists regarding some of the climate hazards in the city and Central Florida in general. And then we also have our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which we've been collecting every year since 2007. Initially, we were doing this every 2 to 3 years, but we've gone back and plugged in a lot of data, which we use to provide the trends I shared earlier. From a highlight, and I promise that I'm working back towards inland flooding and that question as well, because that's something we highlight in this document. Per the Global Covenant of Mayors Agreement, we completed this climate vulnerability assessment in line with the framework that they provided. So this is the international standard. Just as we're seeing the GPC guidelines for greenhouse gas emissions inventories, this is a similar caliber and specification that cities around the world are utilizing to report their climate vulnerabilities. And the way that we have this broken down in this document is the current probability, so what we're seeing now, the current consequence in terms of assets and services impacted, in terms of statistics regarding, in the case of precipitation, how much we're seeing in a given year and how that's affecting our environment, our society, and so on. What's the frequency of those events, the intensity or the magnitude, the timescale that we may be seeing increases or changes over time. Is that current? Is it going to happen the next 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years? What the impact of this change over time would be, the specific services and assets impacted, and then our ability to adaptively address some of these concerns just based on some of our local factors here in the city. And we can see across some of our top concerns here, I think some of the things I want to draw your attention to is the green line, which represents a current consequence of this particular concern. So extreme heat, of course, is very high. Probability is this large blue line. So across the board, what are we seeing now? And then looking into the future, some of these darker shades here, the darker blue, darker green, and then the magnitude of some of these impacts that we're going to see over time. So really, we have a lot of high level risks. These particular numbers in terms of this relatively simple scale were derived from some state level assessments and how a high, medium, low, or somewhat high, somewhat low impact were described and ranked accordingly. But really what we're seeing across the board is just a high number of those different types of events and vulnerabilities that have a high amount of impact that we're already seeing currently, and that we can expect to see more of, but that this is only going to increase in time, and we already need to be prepared and addressing these concerns. It certainly affects our local GDP, increases our energy expenditures necessary just to keep a reliable and resilient power grid. For our residents as well. We're seeing increase across the board in terms of public health concerns, of course, not only with the safety, that some of the safety concerns that these particular events provide, but from the lens of extreme heat and thinking of some of these social equity concerns. We have a lot of vulnerable populations across the state of Florida, in this state with such a high extreme heat, who really can't afford to lose power during the storm season, because it intersects with our hottest summer months as well.
Yeah, I think the only thing that Brittany you're missing there is storm surge. You guys have the threats to facing Central Florida and Orlando are pretty extensive.
Right, exactly. Yep, from a state level perspective, I think that's the only thing that's different. And at the time in 2017, climate migration was not detailed in any state level or county level reports. And that's the only reason that that risk is not listed here. And so, yeah, looking really across the board, we get a little bit of it all. And of course, it's all related. So whenever we see tropical cyclones, with them come the inland flooding, lightning, spin-off tornadoes, and things of that nature. So once there begins to be this activity that we're seeing in the Atlantic, like we are right now, we see an increase in all of those, which hold their own risks and hazards, beyond just what we're seeing in the cyclonic activity. So there is certainly a lot to consider. And in terms of the breakdown and how each of these are assessed, I'm happy to share the document if it's of interest. It is a little lengthy, it's around 80 pages. But in each of these, we have the current probability defined, as I mentioned, low, medium, high. Is this increasing or decreasing in the future? What is the time scale from current to longer term? And then what is the magnitude, all the way from less serious to extremely serious? And we can just expect to see more heat anomalies over time, as well as a general trend in higher temperatures over time, which again has an influence certainly on our bodies of water as well, complicating some of those outbreaks that we see across pollutants in those areas. Longer summers, shorter winters. I mean, pretty much any trend that could demonstrate that it's going to get hotter, it's going to stay hotter for longer periods of time, and that this is only going to get worse is currently what's really clear in the data across the state of Florida. We have the most dangerously hot days, and we are going to see some of the largest increases in those days in comparison to other states. I also mentioned being centrally located leads to some stagnant air, which can mean that some of those local air pollutants can stay, and there tends to be resting ozone in the area rather than being swept away by some of the breezes and currents that we'd see if we were closer to the coast. And what that means for public health is, again, elevated hospitalizations, particularly for some of our vulnerable populations and anyone who needs to be outdoors or doesn't have access to air conditioning. In some of these cases, it might be just inefficient spaces and lack of opportunity to get somewhere where there can be cooling. So that's something like providing cooling stations, for example, is one of the potential solutions that we're looking at as potential outside pop-up solutions that can be deployed, just as with electric vehicle charging and other resiliency hub type of needs, some of which could be permanently installed in community centers and gathering places that are accessible, others which could be deployed as needed depending on these storms. Again, considering the efficiency of some of these spaces, poverty and inequality is really top of mind. In terms of providing affordable housing, we know utilities are the second largest expenditure after rent or mortgage, and we want to be able to keep some of those bills low. But unfortunately, what we see from an energy burden perspective is often that those in low income areas also pay the single largest proportion of their monthly bills towards their energy costs, specifically because the spaces are so inefficient. Of course, in terms of economic health, we see a disruption in our tourism and outdoor labor impacts, again, anyone who's outside, and capacity constraints. It's very straining on our grid to be able to provide such an increase in providing air conditioning for everybody during this time. And then when we have disruptions from some of these storms and we have all these generators coming on, it's a very disruptive process. It doesn't really stand well in the way of reliability and certainly not resiliency, which is one of the driving factors that we're looking towards, particularly regarding pursuing 100% clean energy by 2050. With our other area that we were talking about, tropical storms and hurricanes and cyclonic activity that we see, there we are right in the middle of all of this Atlantic storm activity in regards to tropical storms and hurricanes. We already know that we're seeing these events quite consistently during our storm months. There's a high consequence and it's only increasing, extremely serious for us. Certainly, we discussed, our location puts us at risk regardless of which way a storm may turn. So we tend to prepare regardless. What we do see is an increase in those surface water temperatures, air temperatures, and moisture, which really is the perfect environment, unfortunately, for these storms to occur and to strengthen around the state of Florida, particularly. Of course, there's a huge impact on the safety and security that we see here locally in regards to some of the impacts from the storm itself, such as debris, the power outages, again, going back to extreme heat. And this is really where we start to get into that problematic ecosystem we were describing, and then an increase in food and waterborne illness as we see some of that infiltration that you were mentioning earlier, Shannon, regarding pollutants that might be in some of our water supply, and this just spreading even further when we see some of this flooding and increased precipitation events. In regards to some of our infrastructure, that's another element of increased wear, tear, and damage that we see during these storms, and something we need to be able to prepare for, as well as respond to right away. If we have roads that are not traversable, we're not able to deploy our fire trucks, for example, and our police vehicles to go out there and to try to serve some of the residents, particularly those who are at risk. And some of that comes from debris, but some of it can be also from flooding that we see across the city as well as down power lines and other unsafe conditions. So this is really multifaceted, kind of systemic level of concern that we're seeing, and then trying to provide as much as we can in the way of services for all those who are able to prepare their home or provide an opportunity to evacuate. Again, there's low to moderate income household concerns there as well in terms of access to transportation and ability to prepare to take time off work. It's always a stressful period when there are storms approaching, be able to get what the supplies that are needed and then respond accordingly. And certainly, again, this is disruptive to the economic health of our area, and continuing to serve as the local hub for hospitality and tourism that we're known for, that really drives our economy. Some things that we've utilized in order to respond to hurricanes are a number of certifications that our Emergency Management Division has established across both NOAA and the oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name right now. But in regards to some of the national certifications for being storm ready, and also providing opportunities to further explore green infrastructure, low impact development, and some of those roll out deployable solutions such as mobile solar and storage stations, and some of our fleet changes that we plan to see over time as well. We have a really interesting solar deployment project right now on our fleet and facilities compound, where we have grid to vehicle and vehicle to grid technology that we're seeing being prototyped in that space for the first time, where electric vehicles can actually serve as storage in and of themselves to be able to feed back into the grid there, which is a unique solution and something that we can certainly take advantage of as we begin to transition our fleet further towards electric vehicles.
Awesome. I wanted to let everybody know that I've been able to join. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your patience. And it sounds like, Brittany, you've been off to a great start here.
Hey, Chris, though, now that I have both you guys here, I do want to, transition here and find out, you guys are just collecting such a fantastic amount of data. And it seems like you have the plans in place to know what your, where you need to make changes, right, to meet your goals. You're collecting the data in order to find out how it is that you can measure and then accomplish those goals. And so how is all of this, and either of you just jump in, how is it helping to move Orlando into developing a climate strategy, and sort of be that leader? It's a leader that I see you guys as being, and Brittany, what you've shown us right here, just in understanding these hazards and what needs to be done is, is just so, it's so clear that you guys are putting in the work to really develop a strong strategy. And I just want to hear how that's playing out.
That's actually right in line. If you want to move forward, Britt, to the next slide. I think we belabored the point around vulnerabilities enough for us to dive into the actual nuts and bolts of what we're doing. And so to that point, as you can see here, we have been fortunate to be selected for a fantastic initiative called the American Cities Climate Challenge. And as part of that, we were selected as one of 25 cities in the country as winners out of the top 100 cities working on climate. And it was because of our comprehensive approach that I think allowed us to be a winner in this. But when it comes down to it, and Brittany shared earlier the greenhouse gas emissions breakdown, right? And what we saw was that over 70% of our emissions profile for the entire city is being attributed to buildings using dirty energy. And so first and foremost, the strategy centers in around how do we reduce the overall energy loads of the city, and therefore driving more energy efficiency within the built environment. That's centered. Secondly is this notion around decarbonizing our energy supply that are powering those buildings. And so increasing renewable energy adoption, absolutely critical. Third is, and the other kind of 25% or so of our emissions profile is on the transportation side. That's the use of gasoline and diesel and all of those fuels and the emissions from them. So reducing vehicle miles traveled and focusing in on new initiatives to get people out of their car and into alternative sources is absolutely critical to reducing emissions. And then lastly, this notion around electrifying our vehicles and our buses, right? And this is our short, this is not everything under the sun of our climate strategy, because there are also what we call nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions that focus on our urban forestry initiatives. And as Brittany was mentioning, green infrastructure and LID. So, but when it comes down to, and we often use the bathtub analogy, right, regarding climate change. Bathtub being, basically the volume of the bathtub being the carbon budget, the water coming out of the spigot being carbon emissions, And right now we have water literally overflowing the bathtub. And there are two thought processes here. One is, how do we quickly turn off as fast as possible the spigot so that the water coming out is halted and we move towards net zero emissions? And two, how do we adapt our communities? And maybe it's, you know, the bathroom floor outside of the tub. How do we adapt our communities to, you know, to be able to withstand some of these changes? Do we increase the size of the walls of the bathtub so that we can take more water, right? That's the adaptation side and some of the things we're doing around storm surge protection and the like. So we're really focused on how do we turn off the tap? How do we mitigate this problem, you know, with the issues that we face, because we own our own electric utility, right? We're a major contributor to that problem, and that is center to that. So, Britt, if you can move to the next slide, we wanted to run through a series of different policy and programs that we've implemented to begin addressing this down to the root. And so first and foremost, cities are in the position to lead by example. And that's something that Mayor Dyer has for a long time prioritized. We have had a commitment, basically an executive order since 2010, that every new city building that we own has to be a LEED certified building. LEED is the Leadership for Energy and Environmental Design certification. It's a green building certification by the U.S. Green Building Council. And so every building since then has been built, and that includes Amway Center to the new soccer stadium, and not just venues, but also community centers, admin buildings, and the like. And so we've built, I think it's 16 buildings over the last 10 years, and all of them have achieved LEED. Next. In addition, though, to building new buildings, we've also realized that the vast majority of our square footage, 7.2 million square feet, is already built. So how do we start going back to those older buildings that may not have been built with efficiency in mind and begin to retrofit those? So Brittany and I have a wonderful colleague. His name is Ian Lahith. He's our energy manager in facilities and has been cornerstone to deploying about $20 million worth of a green bond that we took out to begin retrofitting these buildings and beginning to save the amount of energy that they're using, and therefore save the emissions that a building you know, is associated with. Believe it or not, there's so much waste in the energy system that for every 1 unit of energy that you save at the building, you end up saving 4 units of energy at the power plant. So think about that calculus, right? If we can start to save kilowatt hours at our homes, that's 4 kilowatt hours at the power plant, and you multiply that across the entire city. That's why energy efficiency in buildings has been recognized as the most cost-effective and impactful way to reduce emissions. So long story short, we've been doing a lot of retrofitting. This first phase has been 55 buildings, and so we benchmarked our entire portfolio of 7.2 million square feet, and we identified the biggest energy hogs, and we basically said, okay, you 55 buildings, we need to focus on retrofitting them. We did intensive energy audits, and out of those energy audits came these high-level energy efficiency measures that we've invested in, right? And now we're seeing tracking at 23% savings of energy use intensity compared to the baseline in 2011 when we started tracking. And that means real dollars. That's $2 million per year that we're tracking now in avoided costs just from making green improvements to buildings that actually have direct economic benefits as well. Next. So of course, you know, needing to lead by example, I did not mention yet that all of those retrofits also incorporated building automation and controls so that we can get down to the granular data, back to the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. If we didn't do that, we wouldn't know that buildings are 72% of our problem, right? Well, same thing with these big municipal buildings. Like if we're not paying attention to them, more often than not, we're wasting a lot of energy and a lot of money. And so we've been really focused on getting that real-time data, having populating a dashboard that gives us alerts and predictive analytics in real time and help us to basically continue to be more efficient. Next. Britt, I'll turn it over to you about BWES real quick.
Sure. So this policy, BWES, stands for the Building Energy Water Efficiency Strategy. And it's one of the policies that we partnered with a number of peer cities, 20 to be exact, in pushing forward similar policies because they had been demonstrated as a best practice. And ultimately, when you can think of BWES or a benchmarking transparency policy, it's asking our largest buildings, those that represent only 5% of the number of buildings across the city, but take up more than 50% of our square footage, asking those buildings to step on the scale. lifting the hood and getting a 1 to 100 score of how efficient that building type is. And that's based on a number of factors, our local weather conditions and climate in the state of Florida, and as well as the building space type, the occupancy levels that we're seeing, so on and so forth. So really an apples to apples comparison. Where buildings that often may have been designed well, need retunement, some of them might be due for some improvements, can benefit from an audit with our local utility, and asking these buildings, it's about 1,000 in total, to report their annual energy usage data. And in many cases, this does include water use as well. Obviously, there are huge impacts, as demonstrated here on the left, just through the energy water nexus with the way our energy is currently generated for the most part that we're seeing here in the city of Orlando, and the huge impacts that we can look to see just by enabling this information, asking these building owners to use the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool, which is free. To get that score, to provide this comparison, we make that publicly available so that tenants and actors in the real estate market can compare those data points. Like we mentioned earlier, utility costs are the second largest expenditure after rent or utilities. And often you go into a new space, whether you're renting out an office space or moving into a high-rise apartment, and have no idea what you can anticipate in terms of your utility bills every month. This makes that information actionable and holds the building owners and operators accountable. And by providing that information, what we've seen across the country in cities that have implemented similar strategies is a decrease in overall energy consumption, an increase in potential opportunities for improvements in some of those spaces. Even though that's not required, even though there isn't a performance requirement for those buildings, low performers can stay low performers. What we've seen is once they get a foot through the door, get a better handle on how their building is operating, want to maintain a competitive advantage, increase their property value, reduce operating expenses, and of course, preserve these resources across the community, that with the city of Orlando specifically, using the most conservative estimates, we partnered with a policy impact analysis firm and found that this policy will save us over $200 million in energy savings over time, preventing more than almost 1 billion gallons of water consumed at the power plants, just in the way that our that I was mentioning, that our energy systems currently operate. And also, what I always find to be so compelling is over $64 million in reduced healthcare costs due to increased air quality, and that comes from reductions in things like asthma, COPD, and other pulmonary disorders that can be mitigated just by improving our air quality and increasing efficiency across those spaces.
Excellent. And obviously this information is published every year, so we accept it and then we clean it and then publish it on an open data website, so people in the real estate environment can begin to make apples to apples comparisons of how buildings operate, not just how much is it to rent this place, but how much I'm going to spend in utilities and the total cost to live and work. That is what really matters for people. Next, real quick, so we're the only city in the state of Florida that has implemented that policy that requires this level of transparency, and we have also seen Miami-Dade, Tampa, and others starting to move on it as well. So it's pretty exciting to see it gaining traction.
Chris, I just want to chime in and just thank you guys for all of that work on buildings. I don't think that people understand, quite frankly, the impact that the largest buildings in our cities have on overall climate change and emissions. And obviously you guys are doing such a good job of measuring, but I think you're also doing a good job of just like, I mean, these are just facts, right? They're just facts from the city in terms of like, what is our impact? Where is it coming from? Exactly. And having that, being able to show people real time with numbers, and it's just, you know, unparalleled in terms of being able to communicate, you know, what we're doing. And I love that your next slide here is equity mapping, because that was really where I wanted to go next, is just find out, you know, you're doing so much with buildings, but I also know that you're doing a lot with actually mapping, you know, where some of these different policies fall on our vulnerable communities, on maybe racially diverse communities, you know, people economically challenged. And so, you know, tell me about what Orlando's doing when it comes to sort of addressing those concerns and also understanding those concerns.
Sure. Yeah, normally when people think about sustainability, they put us into the bucket of the environment and don't realize that this is truly about the triple bottom line. Sustainability, true sustainability, is about people, planet, and our collective prosperity. It's addressing social issues, environmental issues, and ensuring economic prosperity and vitality. And it's in fact not sustainable unless you have all three. If it's just good for the environment but not good for the economy, guess what? It's not sustainable either. If it's just good for the people and not good for the planet or the economy, it's also not sustainable. So we have to figure out what that nexus looks like. And so for us in this role, Brittany, myself, and our entire staff have really taken on an equity position. And I'm happy to say that Mayor Dyer and our council have prioritized a new chief equity officer starting in October for the city of Orlando. This is a historic position, but we are realizing that to move forward the vision in Orlando that we have to start to figure out how to address some of the unintended and disproportionate impacts that often communities of colors face. One of those being energy burden. So to the point on this slide, we started to map out a number of inequities around food insecurity and food access, transportation modes down to the neighborhood parcel, energy, water, and gas burdens. And this is a snapshot of the electricity burden, but most people don't realize that it's not an apples to apples thing. Like, people are spending often 2 and 3 times as much per square foot in their rental apartment than more affluent communities are in an entire home. And it comes down to the fact that there's a landlord-tenant dilemma in that the landlord is reluctant to make improvements because they don't see the benefit of the lower utility bills. The tenant is reluctant to make those improvements because they don't own the home. And so we end up in this rock and a hard place situation. And so what cities have done is started to, one, map out where are these inequities. And as you can see, some really hot spots where people are spending 15 and 18% of their annual household income on just powering and, their utilities. And the average, as you can see there, nationally is 2.5%, and in Orlando is about 4.5%. So pretty significant, amount of money people are spending. And so from this, it has helped us to identify ways, programs that we should start to target. And that goes to this next slide around energy financing and enabling programs. Believe it or not, cities have been in the game in the recent, past few years in actually enabling capital and financing for homeowners and business owners to make these qualified improvements. The 3 logos at the top are the 3 main programs we currently have up and running. One's called Efficiency Delivered, which is a free home energy and water audit of any home or any business in Orlando provided by our utility. And then up to $2,500 worth of improvements. They just increased it from $2,000 to $2,500, and they added other things like AC tune-ups because we realized that air conditioning is 60 to 70% of your bill, and a lot of the challenge was outdated, AC systems that just needed a little tweak or tune-up. So Efficiency Delivered's there. We also have this PACE program, Property Assessed Clean Energy. And then lastly, SELF, which is a nonprofit that we've partnered with that is a community development finance institution, CDFI, and they provide low interest loans to homeowners. And 70% of their capital has to go to LMI communities. So it's very much a focused program to address energy burden and water burden.
Brittany, when we met with Chris to kind of plan this webinar, we both, Shannon and I said, I think we need a 2-hour webinar. Things that Orlando are doing. I wish we, unfortunately, we won't be able to get to, dive deep into all the stuff you're doing. But I just honestly, I'm amazed that you guys, one, y'all are able to stay on top of all these initiatives, collecting data, benchmarking, implementing these programs, and doing it so well, and really standing out as a leader. I want to give you some kudos on that, because I'm overwhelmed just watching your presentation, how you keep up with all this.
It's great, but
Good point.
I think what stands out to me though is, you guys are leading the way on this. Like, what about the surrounding counties? What about those surrounding cities? How can we sort of step up and be a part of this? Because Orlando can't just be like this beacon of how it should be done in North Florida. I want us to follow you. I want us to lead. So sort of, if you could end on that, I guess today, Chris, and we won't get to a lot of comments, but just end with like, how can we help you in this? How can we follow, and what will you leave us with that we can mimic the great work that Orlando's doing.
Well, I'll leave you with a little bit of hope here. And Britt, if you can scroll all the way, like exit out, scroll to the bottom of our stuff, you'll get a quick snapshot of all the cool stuff we were going to show you on renewable energy and electric vehicles. We're doing so much in this space. You're right, Jimmy. It could have taken 2 hours. But I do want to end off here with really exciting progress that we've been making. And we had the same, thought, right? Every time I go out to speak in the community, and I'm sure it's the same with Brittany, we usually have somebody who doesn't live in Orlando but wants to take advantage of our programs. How do I get a free composter? What about the free trees? Like, I want that too, but I live in Maitland. And so we got a little tired of hearing that same question and proactively started to pull together some partners and approached the Regional Planning Council, East Central Florida Regional Planning Council, which looks over these 7 counties that you see here, 8 counties actually that you see there. And what we decided to do was emulate what South Florida had done in creating a regional climate compact. 10 years ago, they led the charge. Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, Broward, and Marion County all came together and they created a compact that focused on being more resilient to climate change and sea level rise and the like. And they've been doing tremendous progress in collaborating because of that. So we approached the Planning Council and were very successful in them getting a grant to bring on a resilience officer. Her name is Jennifer Rupert. She's been unbelievable to work with, and she's really led the charge on establishing what we call the Regional Resilience Collaborative, the R2C. Right now, if you go to the next slide, there are over 32 governments that have officially joined this voluntarily. They've passed a full memorandum through their council. And this includes all 5 counties on the far east, so Volusia, Brevard. It also includes Orange, Seminole, and Osceola. We are working on Lake and Marion and Sumter. Those conversations continue. But we're really excited that in addition to counties, cities have really jumped on board. And Katrina in Volusia County, our colleague, has done a pretty amazing amount of work on the resilience side of things. And we're working together on a regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So basically that same data exercise we showed you earlier, but for the entire region. How much emissions are we contributing and where are those sectors? And it's going to be different than City of Orlando because not every area within the, this region has a dense downtown, business district and, a lot of commercial.
I think Chris froze there. Oh, there you go, Chris.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, on behalf of Jimmy and myself here at St. John's Riverkeeper, we're just really thankful for you guys for sharing some of this. I know in the chat window there, we linked to places where folks can find out more about the Greenworks initiative from Orlando, because there's a lot there. Also, we'll share Chris and Brittany's contact information if folks have more questions that we didn't get to today, because I know we didn't get to some of our viewer comments. But I just want to thank you guys again for joining us. And Jimmy, if you want to chime in there.
Yeah, and one thing, if y'all could share your PowerPoint with us, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people actually that signed up for the presentation that did not join us this afternoon. So I'd love to send it so everybody can see the full range of all the programs, because obviously we weren't able to get to everything that you're doing. But I think that's the thing that I take away from this is how you're really looking at things holistically and comprehensively across all sectors of the community. And I think that's the only way we're going to get to that place where we can actually call cities, we can actually consider cities sustainable and resilient. And so I commend you for all the great work and being leaders on this in Orlando. And we look forward to learning from you. We actually in Jacksonville area, there's a resiliency committee that the city council has formed. And so I really want to share some of this information with them and some of our city council members, so they can hopefully learn best practices from what you guys are doing. So thank you so much, Brittany, and thank you, Chris. We really appreciate what you're doing and commend you for all your good work.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Shannon. I don't know if you can still hear me, but
we can hear you.
That. Okay, good.
For our viewers, next episode, River Rising Solutions webcast. It's going to be on September the 9th, and the focus is resiliency via the tree canopy. We'll be joined by Karen Firehook, Executive Director of the Green Infrastructure Center, based out of Virginia. And so tune in and learn more about the tree canopy as a river rising solution. Thanks to everybody, and have a good day.
Thanks everyone for
Thanks so
joining us.
much.